Okay, thank you, and welcome to everybody, and thank you for coming at this late afternoon slot. Oh, wait, one more. I should have done this sooner. Okay, thank you very much for coming. Welcome. My name is Bunton. I'm chairing this session from University of Victoria in Canada. We have only the two paper presenters unfortunately weren't able to come in the end, which helps us a little bit with our time at any rate in terms of starting later. Our first, both papers take us somewhat to the periphery, or to other awakenings is the title of the panel. Our first paper, to be delivered by three presenters, takes us to Bahrain, which we haven't heard very much about over the last couple of days. And our second paper to Kuwait. Our first paper, our presenters, and I understand they will take turns presenting, are Amina Nolte, Ansar Jasim, and Schluwa from the University of Marburg. And I gather there are a few people in the audience from the University of Marburg also. And they're presenting on imagining the Pearl Roundabout in Bahrain as a social space. Question mark, as a social space. Thank you very much.
Hello. First of all, thank you for having us here, and thank you for the discussion afterwards. The title of our presentation is From Place to Space, the Pearl Roundabout in Bahrain. Many so-called revolutions have taken place in the so-called Arab world in the previous 2 years, which received a huge attention by Western media. Largely neglected both by the scientific community as well as by human rights organizations, NGOs and Western media was Bahrain and its revolutionary movement, and as such, its brutal crackdown by the Bahraini regime. Therefore, we wanted to shed light on this and on the key aspects of this movement. This paper analyzes, by taking the Pearl Roundabout in the Bahrain's capital Manama as an example, how the Bahraini state consolidated its hegemony prior to 2011 and how this became contested by the Bahraini protest movement in 2011. The assumption underlying this paper and the research which is presented in this paper is not yet finished and therefore up to discussion. After a brief overview and summary of the main happenings that led to the still ongoing protest movement, I'm going to give some empirical data to emphasize our argumentation. Then my colleague Amina is going to present us the strategies of governance, the Pearl Roundabout as a place. That is followed by the presentation of my colleague Schluwa and her assumption of strategies of resistance to state power, the Pearl Roundabout as a social space. There are several reasons, and most of them have deep historical roots that led to the emergence of the current protest movement in Bahrain. Due to a lack of time, I can only outline the happenings of 2011 that need to be taken into consideration to comprehend and follow our argumentation. The current uprising began on February 14, followed by the occupation of the Pearl Square in Bahrain's capital, Manama, by protesters on February 15. On February 17, fire was opened on the assembling protesters on the Pearl Square, who had built up a tent city with social infrastructure such as field hospitals and soup kitchens. As you can see on this site, it's a tent city. Those who helped to maintain this infrastructure were volunteers of all segments of society. The slogans chanted on the Pearl Square, such as "No Sunni, no Shia, we are all Bahrainis," challenged regime rhetoric that characterized the protesters is sectarian and solely Shia. After the Gulf Cooperation Council, GCC, agreed to deploy Peninsula Shield Force troops to Bahrain, security forces, backed by tanks and helicopters, stormed the Pearl roundabout on March 16, where protesters had camped for about a month. On March 18, the government ordered to demolish the Pearl Monument, which is called Nasb al-Lu'lu in Arabic. This was said to erase bad memories. The place remains surrounded by security forces up to this day. Here we can see 3 steps. The first step is the still intact monument, and the second 2 steps you can see how the monument was demolished. And by the way, on this day, a worker died by demolishing this monument. After the destruction of the monument by the government, it could be witnessed that the protesters have used the physically erased monument as a symbol for their political actions. To show this, I'm going to give some examples now. This database is mostly taken out of Facebook groups run by Bahraini political activists. As we can see, is the monument used as a logo and thus as a symbol for the oppositional movement. We found over 30 groups on Facebook using the monument as a logo. Remarkably, is that the symbol is only used by the new revolutionary movement that arose out of the demonstrations on the Pearl roundabout in 2011. And the symbol is not used by the traditional parties. This Facebook group shows one of our main findings. The symbol is used in a non-sectarian context, which means without the combining of religious symbols. So the text of this Facebook page reads, "The popular revolution, non-Sunni, non-Shia." Moreover, the symbol is not only used in the sphere of social media, but rather on banners on demonstrations. The most obvious witness that the monument became the main symbol of the newly emerged protest movement is its usage on the Bahraini flag. Moreover, the text on the flag reads, "We will return to Martyrs Square, عايدين لميدان الشهداء," showing 2 findings. First of all, a kind of Palestinian return discourse. The protesters aim to return to the Pearl Square as their main place of protest. They even call it, in a Palestinian-like manner, right of return, حق العودة. The second finding is the renaming of the Pearl roundabout as either Martyrs Square or even Square of Freedom, Midan al-Hurriya. The monument is sprayed on walls all over around Bahrain and therefore visible for everyone, and therefore contests the state's omnipresence. Another finding is the usage of the monument in a more kitschy context. This is showing that the monument as a symbol became romanticized, or even as it is shown on this picture, became a nationalistic touch, as the Bahraini flags on the right-hand side illustrate. The emotional connection to the monument as a symbol is shown in this picture. All these examples lead us to formulate our key assumptions as followed. Only the destruction of the Pearl roundabout by the Bahraini government turned the Pearl monument from a materialistic place into symbolic social space. I'm going to follow up on Ansar's presentation, and I'm going to talk about the actual place. We are basing our research, that is still ongoing, on the assumption that urban planning became an important governance strategy in Bahrain in the last years. And this means that by studying the strategies of city planning and investment in real estate in Bahrain, you can try to understand how the regime came to consolidate its power throughout the years. Unfortunately, we don't have time to go into the details about this, but we try to briefly explain it with our example, the Pearl Roundabout we already started talking about. So this is the place Ansar was also talking about, which is became used in the revolution in Bahrain, so-called revolution. And I'm just going to explain briefly how it came into existence. It marks the end of Manama's northern business district in Bahrain, and it was built after the third Gulf Cooperation meeting in Bahrain that took place in 1982. And since then, the roundabout includes a monument that was erected by the king and the government to promote publicly the political and economic ties of Bahrain with its Gulf neighbors. So the monument consists of 6 sails reaching towards a pearl. And this is the 6 sails designate the 6 members of the Gulf Cooperation Council. The pearl is supposed to symbolize their united history and their shared legacy in pearl cultivation. It manifestly stresses the close ties between Bahrain and the Gulf state, also aiming at the legitimation of the close military and financial cooperation between the Sunni regimes. When we consider the regime's deliberate economy policies and the constant effort to control its people, not just by means of violence, but also governance strategies, we think that the Pearl Roundabout, with its symbolic implications, can be best understood as a top-down governance strategy of the ruling elite in Bahrain. It was erected as a visible place in order to stress the political ties and political and economic ties between Bahrain and its Gulf neighbors, linking Bahrain to its ancient wealth, like the pearl wealth, and pillowed and supported by the GCC financial and security promise. And with this symbolic placement in Manama's northern business district, the Pearl Roundabout as a place came to be an urban manifestation of the regime's dominance, enforcing a certain understanding of Bahraini identity on its people. And it's an important part of our argumentation that the Pearl Roundabout as an actual place came to represent the state's hegemony. This hegemony is deeply incorporated within the regime's neoliberalist governance approach and security discourse. We consider the regime's strategy to create common sense, Schluwa is going to talk about later on, within society. So to sum up, we can consider the Pearl Roundabout as a place that is a part of an urban planning program of the Bahraini regime. It is placed directly and symbolically in the northern district of Manama, that can be called the core of the financial district there. And many Bahrainis, by commuting in the city, can face it every day from going one place to the other. So it can be viewed as a materialistic and direct embodiment of the state's attempt to enforce a certain state idea on its people. And as we can see, as a place that is highly visible and central in the city, but as we also will see, therefore is it highly contestable. Maybe not in its existence, but in the meaning it is transporting. And Schluwa is going to talk about this a little bit more.
Okay. Having all these governance strategies in mind now, the questions for possibilities of resistance to state power remains unanswered. So here we are asking in what ways is it possible to resist state power, and how is it possible in the specific case of Bahrain, where state power is so omnipotent? To investigate this further, it is worth considering the theory of hegemony by Antonio Gramsci. Yeah, and of course, I'm just giving a short and simplified version of his theory here. Gramsci makes a methodological distinction between the two governance strategies, whereby the strategy of consent is in discourses or through architecture and monuments, is located within civil society. And whereas, in contrast to political society, the state puts through its power through pure coercion. So in this context, social space is a part of the consent strategy, and thus it's located within civil society. It can be described as opposite to place, and the social space is therefore transformable and transferable, and it can be redefined by people who acquire it. As already explained by my colleague Amina, urban spatial structures, including monuments, are an important governance strategy to strengthen the state's hegemony. Thus, this governance strategy is part of the state's constant strategy of ruling as opposed to its coercive strategy. And here we argue that by consolidating its power through monuments, it's precisely at this moment when monuments can also become heavily contested by citizens within civil society, and strategies of resistance seem possible. This is also what we want to argue happened in Bahrain. The square became a contested place. It was after an ongoing protest on the square, the regime decided on a heavy crackdown. We had many protesters who were killed and injured and died in the clashes between police forces. The regime did not only rely on coercive strategies. In fact, we can witness how much effort it put also in its consent strategy, because it depicted this cleaning of the square as a erasing of bad memories. And apart from the obvious destruction of the monument, it also said that also banned all coins and money notes where the Pearl Roundabout was depicted on as a picture. So it banned all its money, which is an obvious sign, and which clearly indicates that there was little discursive hegemony left within civil society. Therefore, we argue that the common sense is no longer able to support the state's hegemony. The common sense in the case of Bahrain is made up mainly by the neoliberal ideology. And we have a short definition of common sense according to Antonio Gramsci, which is defined as a set of attitudes and values of the ruling class which are promoted and accepted by society at large as their own attitudes. What follows is that the state is no longer able to strengthen its power through a convincing mindset. It has little hegemony left within civil society, which is why the state concentrates more and more on its use of force within political society. Being omnipotent in the political sphere, for example on the street, the state press people out of the sphere and leaves the protesters no other choice as to resist within civil society, and especially the social space as part of the civil society. I want to stress here that therefore the Pearl Roundabout as a symbol became totally disconnected from the Pearl Roundabout as a place itself. So we argue that the only possibility of resistance to the state was for the protesters to engage in the discourse of the state and its main symbol, the Pearl Roundabout, and thus it was possible for them to challenge state's hegemony. As you see here, the aim of the state was to erase bad memories, but it could only rely on its coercive strategies. So we see here the place, which is totally built over by streets. It's a normal street, so just to say that. And yeah, we saw that actually the state was not successful in this. We saw that what Ansar already presented us. The protesters were really able to change the discourse in essential ways. In the end, I want to show you a last picture which illustrates this again. Here we see the 6 sails of the Pearl Roundabout, which originally symbolized the 6 members of the GCC and are now replaced by the fists of the Bahraini people. Therefore, we can witness the growing symbolic importance of the Pearl Roundabout as a symbol of resistance in social space. Finally, it should be added that resistance, which is currently taking place in social space, is not limited to social space only. As social space is always connected and intertwined with the place itself, there might always be the mutual influence. Therefore, the possibility of resistance and the real return to the Pearl Roundabout as a place could possibly take place again. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much to all 3 presenters. That was quite fascinating. I've often wondered about, to go back to the materialist side, of the architecture of protest. The Avenue Bourguiba and the Maidan Tahrir, which also carries with it its own irony around it being Tahrir's liberation, that Nasser's redefinition or renaming of it, and then that being the regime, which is toppled by the reclamation of that space as public space. So it's like there is protests require that materialism, don't they? To begin with, at any rate, and then this really quite kind of exciting turning on its head the whole idea of the symbolism of the Pearl Roundabout from one of the pillars of the regime to its greatest weakness. You almost wonder if the regime hadn't outlawed it, it wouldn't have been quite as effective or even as straightforward a symbol of protest. Whether it be, I mean, it's theirs now, and anytime there's a public demonstration of it, it's a protest against the regime. I'm reminded of the Palestinian Intifada, where at the outset, if the flag was outlawed, all it required was hanging a flag, and you protested the regime. Okay. Thank you very much. We'll move on to the next paper, and then we'll stop to ask questions. I had wondered maybe we should stop for questions now, but I think I'll also we'll do the 2 papers because it might be interesting to see what sort of comparisons and similar approaches can be gathered from the 2 papers next to each other. So our second paper is by Rashed Chowdhury, a fellow Canadian. That's okay, thank you. Studying at McGill University in Canada, and he will be presenting on the Kuwaiti Parliament as a fire break in the Arab Spring. Thank you. Thank you.
We have heard about, obviously, about a number of successful reform movements, protest movements, revolutions, what have you, in the Arab world during these past few days. And we've also heard about ones that did not quite succeed for various reasons, including the one in Bahrain. And the case that I'm going to be talking about today is somewhere in between. And I think that's where my interest in it lies. So the ruling regimes in certain parts of the Arab world have managed to more or less fully insulate their domestic political scene from the Arab Spring. These include the ruling families of Gulf countries like Qatar and the United Arab Emirates. It should of course be noted that Qatar pursued a very active and interventionist policy abroad, but that was not matched by similar events at home. In the host of Arab countries that did witness significant participation in the Arab Spring, the issues were largely local, but the sentiment among the protesters was often a common one. The ruling regime had failed and needed to be replaced as quickly as possible with a different system, more responsive to the needs and aspirations of the people. In several of these countries, a number of democratic reforms were instituted as a result of the protests and revolutions, sometimes involving not only the overthrow of existing regimes, but, as we've seen in cases such as Tunisia and Egypt, also the rewriting of the country's constitutions. Kuwait presents us with a seeming paradox. It is a country which saw political protests before and during the Arab Spring. Yet the protesters in Kuwait did not demand regime change so much as regime reshuffling. And by that I mean change within the regime, accomplished by introducing fresh faces into existing institutions. And this is a term that arose in the 1970s. In the famous cases of Tunisia and Egypt, grievances against the regimes of Zainul Abidin bin Ali and Hosni Mubarak may have been long-standing, but the immediate sparks for the revolutions were new, both involving the deaths of young men whose demise came to symbolize everything that was wrong with the two countries' regimes. On the other hand, the Kuwaiti protests were only the latest manifestation of a decades-old dispute between the country's parliament and government as to which should be the leading institution of the state. Lastly, the response of the Kuwaiti authorities to the protests has also been markedly different from those in other Arab countries whose regimes have been faced with protests during the Arab Spring, notably involving fewer arrests and little use of outright violence, as in violence leading to death. The Kuwaiti opposition, both on the street and in parliament, achieved a victory of sorts in November 2011, when the Amir of Kuwait, Sheikh Sabah al-Ahmad al-Jaber al-Sabah, dissolved the government headed by his nephew Sheikh Nasser al-Muhammad al-Ahmad al-Sabah, after the storming of the Kuwaiti government by about 2,000 protesters, who were led by opposition members of parliament. The protesters' choice of venue was no accident. The storming was a symbolic appropriation of the most important representative institution in Kuwait's semi-democratic political system. Unlike most of its neighbors among the Arab states of the Gulf, Kuwait has a long tradition of parliamentary politics dating back to the early 1960s. While the parliament does not have the power to appoint a government or a cabinet of ministers from its midst, it does enjoy the right to question ministers, sometimes leading to the dissolution of a government by the Amir, or more often to the dissolution of parliament by him. Moreover, while formal political parties are not allowed in Kuwait, informal groupings, particularly blocs of Islamist politicians, have long existed and have provided a strong opposition to politicians aligned with the royal family. Thus, Kuwait, despite being ruled by monarchy since before independence, has had several decades of meaningful elections for the originally small but continuously expanding segment of the citizenry that has the right to vote, and political participation for tribes, Islamist groups, and other social actors such as the leading merchant families. Although the parliament was suspended in 1986, it once again became a leading institution after its reopening in 1992, since when it has operated continuously. What the parliament, known as the National Assembly, gave Kuwaitis was not a democracy in the full sense of the word, because of the exclusion of large segments of the Kuwaiti citizenry from the electorate, notably women, until 2006. Longva called the Kuwaiti political system an ethnocracy, with a Kuwaiti minority presiding over a non-Kuwaiti majority, permanently excluded not just from the electorate but from citizenship. Yet even this limited form of democracy gave the average Kuwaiti citizen avenues for political participation. And I should mention that the Economist Intelligence Unit considers Kuwait to be the third most democratic Arab country. As a result, unlike the protests in many other Arab countries, those in Kuwait were small in scale and called not for regime change but rather for a change in governments within the existing political system, and expressed solidarity with the parliament in its struggle to win greater powers from the royal family. A struggle that is, as I mentioned, not new, but has acquired particular prominence since 2006. I thus argue that the National Assembly acted as a pressure valve and allowed for regime stability while increasing the regime's responsiveness to public opinion to some extent. Using an interdisciplinary approach and building on earlier works by Longva, Marianne Detreau, Paul Salem, and others, I will begin by briefly examining the role of parliamentarianism in the history of Kuwait in order to place recent developments in their historical context. I will then look at the Arab Spring as it played out in Kuwait, focusing on the way in which the relationship between the Kuwaiti parliament and government developed from December 2010 to January 2011, which is the month during which Tunisian revolutionaries went from protesting against the treatment of Mohammed Bouazizi to toppling President bin Ali. At this time, Kuwait was gripped by a political crisis of its own. However, there were certain key differences between the situations in Kuwait and Tunisia that will become apparent later in this presentation. For now, I would like to point to one important fact. The protests in Kuwait were already underway before Tunisia saw its first protests. In other words, while most of the revolutions and protest movements we've seen recently in the Arab world took their inspiration directly or indirectly from Tunisia, the Kuwaiti protest movement was already active, although it was no doubt emboldened by developments elsewhere in the Arab world at a later stage of the game. Even additional subsidies derived from Kuwait's oil revenues, a normally effective tool of statecraft, were not sufficient this time for the government to purchase social peace. Yet valorization of the parliament by the Kuwaiti protesters prevented the political standoff from turning into a full-fledged revolution on the Tunisian model. So as I mentioned, parliamentarianism is as old as modern Kuwait, in as much as Kuwait's parliament was one of the founding institutions of the state. The As-Sabah family came to rule Kuwait in the 18th century, although Paul Salem argues that it was the first among equals at that point. Certainly the merchant families that dominated Kuwaiti politics until the discovery of oil were a powerful counterweight to the power of the family. Eventually, under the 1962 constitution, which Kuwait adopted at independence, the powers of the Emir were limited by those of a parliament. The parliament was to be composed of 50 members. Ministers, including the prime minister, did not have to come from the ranks of its members. In fact, by convention, the role of prime minister was always entrusted to the crown prince until 2006. All ministers, who could number up to 15, became ex officio members of parliament. Although the parliament did not have the power to vote out the government, it could question ministers, as I mentioned, up to and including the prime minister. However, no prime minister was actually questioned until 2006 due to his being the same person as the crown prince until that year. So the modern phase of Kuwaiti parliamentary history begins, one could say, in 2006 or even perhaps in 1992, which is the year that the Kuwaiti parliament started functioning once again after the enforced pause that began in 1986 with the dissolution of the parliament. The reasons for the recreation of the Kuwaiti parliament in 1992 were both internal and external. Externally, the United States exerted considerable pressure on Kuwait to democratize. Internally, politicians who had actively resisted Iraqi occupation from inside or advocated for Kuwait from outside with little or no support from the ruling family demanded a role in the governance of the country after its liberation. As Paul Salem points out, Kuwait is unique among Arab monarchies for having a parliament that does enjoy some meaningful powers. Morocco has since overtaken Kuwait in this regard, but one should remember that until the first half of 2011, Kuwait was in a unique position in the Arab world in that sense. So now to go to the events that were concurrent with the Tunisian revolution. In December 2010, just as the revolution was kicking off in Tunisia, a group of opposition members of parliament confronted the government in Kuwait on every possible issue in a bid to increase the powers of the parliament at the expense of the unelected government. Musallam al-Barrak, one of the leading opposition MPs and a member of a populist alliance, protested against what he saw as the justice minister's interference in the work of the Parliamentary Committee for the Protection of Public Funds, which had made allegations about irregularities in the government's financial dealings with Russia. When the government proposed stiffer fines for journalists found guilty of committing offences against the dignity of others, this is the language that this was couched in addition to the existing penalty of imprisonment for such journalists, the parliament was split. On the pro-government side, Ali al-Umayyad urged the government to maintain a hard line, while on the opposition side, Asil al-Awadi called for the abolition of jail terms altogether for journalists. The immediate pertinence of this issue was clear in light of the government's decision a few days earlier, on 8th December, to have a Kuwait University law professor named Ubaid al-Wasmi arrested for organizing a public meeting at which he warned those attending about what he saw as a government plot to move towards a reduction in the constitutional freedoms enjoyed by Kuwaiti citizens. The scholar was publicly beaten and arrested by Kuwaiti Special Forces personnel dispatched to break up the meeting. Al-Wasmi was told he would be charged with several crimes, including undermining the status of the Emir and instigating a rebellion by the armed forces, for which he could be jailed for a total of 11 years. And I should mention that Al-Wasmi is actually still on trial over a year later, and could still be jailed for a few years, although it's not certain. The court meets again next month. Al-Wasmi quickly became a unifying symbol for the Kuwaiti opposition. On 19th December, several hundred people protested, technically legally, against the detention of the academic. Meanwhile, a group of opposition MPs decided to file a demand for the Prime Minister, Sheikh Nasser al-Sabah, to appear before Parliament for a grilling session, which is what questioning government ministers is called in Kuwait, where he would have to answer questions on the crackdown. Other opposition politicians held large meetings at their diwaniyas or salons, which was permissible under Kuwaiti law. So you are allowed to hold political meetings in your salon at home or tents nearby, but not out in the street or a square. Several of these politicians openly called on the Prime Minister to resign. Musallam al-Barrak compared the actions of the Kuwaiti security forces to those of Saddam Hussein during the Iraqi occupation of the country, which is, for all intents and purposes, the ultimate insult in Kuwaiti politics. The Emir was reportedly quite angry at these developments, but there was little he could do immediately to take the situation under control. He reiterated his support for democracy in the face of what he saw as sedition. The situation in the country was reaching a boiling point. Yusuf al-Mubaraki, a columnist writing for the normally pro-government Arab Times, expressed the view that, I quote, people are now tired of the malpractices of the government, particularly the outright abuse of power. The solution, in his view, was for the government to stop treating the parliament with contempt, and for its members, members of the government, that is, to start attending parliamentary sessions regularly. Thus, the solution, in al-Mubaraki's view, was a greater rather than lesser role for parliament. On the 22nd of December 2010, a group of opposition MPs held a press conference at the parliament. Once again, several MPs called on the Prime Minister to resign. The MPs removed the microphones of two pro-government television channels. Musallam al-Barrak once again laid the blame for recent events squarely on the shoulders of the government, accusing it of feeding the country with rotten food. An MP named Khalid al-Tahous stated that it was not the government as a whole, but the Prime Minister in particular, who was responsible for the crisis. Another MP named Jam'an al-Harbash expressed the hope that, I quote, God willing, the grilling will topple this government. Faisal al-Muslim, another opposition MP, voiced the opinion that, I quote, any MP who defends the government is a representative of the Prime Minister, not the people. In the evening, the MPs maintained pressure on the government by taking their case to the public. Several opposition MPs addressed a gathering of about 1,500 at a private diwaniyah, at which they once again called for the government's resignation. Musallam al-Barrak called on the Prime Minister to stop pretending that everything he did was the result of an order from the Emir, thus separating criticism of the government from criticism of the Emir, the latter being taboo in Kuwaiti politics. Throughout the rest of December and early January, as the opposition MPs prepared to grill the Prime Minister, they sought to bring more MPs over to an overtly anti-government stance. Moreover, their goal was now more ambitious than to simply question the Prime Minister about his actions. Instead, they were attempting to drum up a majority which would vote on a non-cooperation motion. Since it was the Emir and not Parliament who selected the Prime Minister, the Parliament could not pass a true no-confidence motion. The hope of the opposition was that a non-cooperation motion would place the government under the moral imperative to resign. As the opposition MP Walid al-Tabatabai declared openly, I quote, our goal is not the grilling, but to rescue the country from the government's failure. On the eve of the grilling session, Musallam al-Barrak jumped the gun and declared, in the name of free people, that this government has been toppled. It was, however, not to be. The opposition did not have a majority on the non-cooperation issue after all, and Sheikh Nasser's government survived the motion by 3 votes. The government was not about to rest on its laurels, however. On 6 January 2011, a day after the attempt to bring it down, it shut down an opposition newspaper and a satellite channel. The opposition did, however, win a symbolic victory when it succeeded in bringing down the Minister of Interior Affairs, another member of the As-Sabah family, Sheikh Jabir Khalid As-Sabah. After a 32-year-old Kuwaiti man named Muhammad al-Mutayri died in custody in suspicious circumstances, Musallam al-Barrak once again accused the security forces of acting like the occupying army of Saddam Hussein. The Interior Minister at first claimed that al-Mutayri had died of a heart condition, which is what he apparently had been told by his subordinates. Al-Barrak responded by saying, I quote, the minister lies to the state, he knows nothing but the language of murder, which is quite something to say in the face of an As-Sabah. Several days later, however, eyewitnesses came forward to testify that members of the police had tortured al-Mutayri to death. Following these revelations, Sheikh Jabir resigned. He had staked his reputation on the Mutayri torture case being false, and now had no political capital left. In his resignation letter, he said, I quote, "It does not honor me to remain in a ministry that tortures citizens." An unusually frank piece of criticism of the government from a member of the Sabah family. And so to conclude, and I'll shorten my conclusion significantly, the difference between the attitude of both the parliament and the minister in the Al-Mutayri case and the attitudes of their Egyptian counterparts in the Khalid Said case, for example, could not be more striking. Whereas it fell to the members of a Facebook group to fight for justice for Khalid Said, in Mutayri's case, his cause had a ready-made defender in the shape of the Kuwaiti parliament. So the point I've been making throughout this presentation is that when public grievances arose, whether over the arrest of Al-Wasmi or the killing of Al-Mutayri, about half the parliament was ready to take these grievances up and to fight publicly with the As-Sabah family, with all of them, with the exception of the Amir himself, on these issues. And as a result, the protest movement functioned as a backup movement to support the parliament in its struggle. Consequently, as opposed to asking for regime change, it actually ensured regime stability, in as much as the parliament was a very important building block of the regime. And just to bring us up to the last few days, currently, there's in fact, the functioning parliament right now is the parliament of 2009, and that was dissolved by the Kuwaiti Amir day before yesterday. There's also a parliament that was elected earlier this year, whose term was immediately terminated by the Constitutional Court. So you have two dissolved parliaments, whose members regularly meet, and neither of whose opposition members actually attend sessions within the parliament building. And so now Musallam al-Barrak, the opposition leader, is actually saying that if the Constitutional Court cannot ensure that government in Kuwait is going to be run constitutionally after the next election coming up in a couple of months, then he is actually promising Arab Spring type protests. But there's a good reason that the actual Arab Spring did not come to Kuwait, and I think the reason is the parliament.
Thank you very, very much, Rashed. I learned a great deal there. I've always wondered how Kuwait is impacted from all this. I wonder if I could start the discussion session by taking the prerogative of the chair and asking the first question rather than making some comments. You did actually answer one of the questions just with your concluding comments, and that is that it's probably fair to say then that the Arab Spring hasn't really come to Kuwait, and it is a question of Kuwait managing the Arab Spring in these ways. That to have some members of parliament take up some issues politically is quite different than the struggle for dignity and distribution of social justice, distribution of resources, etc. elsewhere. And I suppose a big factor in all of that too is the fact that you don't have the same economic problems, at least not if you're Kuwaiti. And if you're not, then you don't really want to protest in the first place because you could be easily deported. So if it does turn into something that is directed more against the family, I was fascinated by the fact that a family member actually resigned, because that it could be a sort of thin edge of a wedge in terms of divine right to rule, because that's a family member saying that he got it wrong. So if a family member can get it wrong in that instance, you wonder how you can maintain that whole idea of divine right to rule. So unfair question to ask a historian, but where do you see this going then? There's an all or nothingness, I'm sort of suggesting.
Right. Well, thanks for the question. I think you're completely right in saying that the sorts of demands that were voiced by the main protest movements in places like Egypt and Tunisia have not been made in Kuwait, and as you say, there's a good reason for that. One is that economic redistribution is a fact of life in Kuwait. There's no income tax. The oil income actually Balsam also talks about this. The oil income of Kuwait does not belong to the royal family, unlike most of the other Gulf states. It belongs to the state, and as such, the royal family only gets a certain large stipend from the state. But all Kuwaitis get some sort of government subsidies, whether it comes to housing or loans to finance weddings, which are a big thing in the Arab world. Many other sorts of subsidies from the government, and of course they have the guarantee, should they want it, of basically a sinecure at a government ministry, or sometimes a real job at a government ministry. And so the result is that among Kuwaitis there is no unemployment other than voluntary unemployment, there are business opportunities for those who are interested. There are loans for those who are interested, etc., etc. So the economic demands, are not part of the picture really. In terms of dignity, I would say that the protests over the arrest of Wasmi, were calls for dignity, the language used by some of the MPs at the protest meetings, would say, now they're beating up members of parliament, now they're beating up Kuwaiti citizens. This idea that, sort of non-Kuwaitis who get in trouble, including once an example I saw, people who were pushing at the gate of a football stadium, people like that get beaten up with truncheons all the time in Kuwait, and that the idea is, here Kuwaitis being beaten up, that is unthinkable, that is unpalatable, cannot be accepted. So to that extent, yes, it was a demand for dignity. As to quickly where it's going, it is hard to tell, but I suspect that the opposition will do even better in the next elections than they did in the earlier ones this year, because I think most Kuwait observers think that the Constitutional Court decided to, which is controlled by the Sabah family, basically decided to abolish the term of the 2012 Parliament because it had a larger representation of the opposition than the 2009 Parliament had. So I think the outcome of these kinds of shenanigans will be, in my opinion, that the opposition will have even greater representation in the next parliament. And I think then the result of that would be that governments, which will probably still be appointed by the Amir if there's no major amendment of the constitution, that governments will still have to learn to gain the confidence of the parliament and to keep the confidence, and will not be able to operate just in the teeth of the parliament, and dissolving the parliament at every action of protest by the parliament will no longer be a viable option.
Thank you. So before I open it up for questions, may I ask you three one question, and that is, why the question mark in the title? Because you seem to make a pretty good case.
Okay, maybe I start and then we add. As we said also in the presentation, one reason might be that we didn't close our research on that, so we watched on 30 Facebook pages, but it's also methodologically selective up to this moment, so we have to further investigate this. So this is why, as a first step, we put a question mark on it. Yeah.
And maybe another point could be the last point Schluwa added, is that, for example, in 2011, on the anniversary of the first protest, which started on February 14th, there was this try to get back to the place itself. That's what Schluwa actually pointed out. Okay, the symbolism is the space, but there's still the idea of returning to the place itself. So it's an ongoing process. Space and place is intermixed.
That's what I found fascinating about the last slide, about the reconstruction of the round. It's not a roundabout anymore. So there is no physical space, so all that remains is is the imagined space. Thank you very much. Are there, perhaps we could take 3 or 4 questions at a time, and then...
Alison Haskell here. I have a question for Amina, Ansar, and Schluwa. I find your presentation quite fascinating, really interesting, and especially bringing Gramsci's hegemony into the equation was particularly interesting for me to see. I'm really curious about your methodology. Perhaps I missed it, perhaps you can clarify it and explain it a little bit more. You mentioned that you selected 30 Facebook pages, but you know, what kind of elements factored into your selection, and what kind of methodology did you use, so on and so forth. If you can just clarify that for us, that would be wonderful. Thank you.
You want to say something? Okay, for the
Yeah.
We'll answer this one.
Okay. First of all, there are really few scientific analyses on this, so we just started to search if this symbol is used, and it turned out okay, it is used. And then we up to now we did like around 1 interview with a Bahraini activist, and it turned out that he pointed out that only the youth movement uses the symbol. So that's what it makes even harder to collect database, because this movement is like, it has no face. They have the spontaneous demonstrations on the streets of Bahrain, but in a quite spontaneous manner. So you can catch them and just make like interviews. And so it's still for the methodology that makes it hard for the methodology to conduct it in a better manner than just watching out these Facebook pages or finding videos on YouTube. I guess it's connected to the nature of the movement itself.
Yeah, and I think also the point I think the moment we decided to present it here, we also started to search for like data only afterwards. I think we started from a quite theoretical point of view. So we started to work with Gramsci and with Lisa Wedin. I don't know if you know her. It's like we worked a lot on the neoliberalist urban structuring thing, and this is like what we decided to. We just wanted to illustrate more what we found, so we can still work on the theoretical frame or background. So we're still looking for the right way to approach it more and more.
And we are open to advice.
Happy for comments.
Thanks very much. Both very interesting and complementary type panels. I guess I'm just interested, obviously the case of the Gulf monarchies is very interesting in terms of the Arab Spring, because they're more or less aligned with Western governments, and none of them have seen any sort of successful revolutions. And I'm wondering if you could both, in the case of Kuwait and Bahrain, comment on the role that Western support for the Bahraini regime has played in our perceptions of the uprisings in Bahrain as a revolution or as a legitimate uprising. And, for example, in Kuwait, if the uprising Arab Spring does come to Kuwait, what role you think Western support might play in its success or otherwise?
Let's handle this one first then.
Okay, I start and then maybe we can, because in our presentation the main focus was on space and place issues. So if from that point of view, I would say that yes, in the end of our presentation we already pointed to the fact that it's possible that this discourse, that because the opposition movement is really dominant in the discourse at the moment, so this discourse could have an influence again, and could lead to a protest movement on the street again, because there was protest movement on the street. They were pushed in the other sphere and are dominant in that sphere, and now maybe because of these theoretical issues that it's intertwined, and discourse always has like lays the foundation for an actual and movement that I guess the possibility is there. How if it's really working, I guess that's hard to say. So I don't know if you want to add up something to that, or I don't know if this might answer your question very well, because yeah, our main focus was on this issue. So from that point of view, yeah, it could be possible again, because it's intertwined, and as it is really dominant, it could lead to the street again, the protest movement.
Did I get your question correctly? That you asked about like foreign intervention, like how much they interfere with? So yeah, I mean, we had a part in our paper focusing on how like the situation. I mean, the US, they have a really strong like big hold on Bahrain. That they I just read like space-wise, or what we focused on, that it's quite interesting because the Pearl roundabout is not so far from the marine bases from the US. And that this is somehow connected to how they react, like how the crackdown, how heavy the crackdown actually was. So yeah, I think, I mean, of course, this is also something we're still working on. What I tried to explain with the Pearl roundabout, how it symbolizes also the strong ties with Saudi Arabia. And I mean, it's interesting because the Pearl roundabout stresses the ties with Saudi Arabia, and in the same time, Saudi Arabian troops entered Bahrain to like help with the crackdown of the Bahraini population that protested on that place. So yeah, I mean, this is, I mean, I think we're still, I mean, we're not experts on this Bahrain, but we are trying to work on like what's going on there with all the different like, yeah, directions.
And another point, just to add, we focused on the domestic discourse, but in an international discourse. Since the Bahraini revolution, okay, has deep roots, and since the 60s, you have a really strong oppositional movement. But the point is, since this time, the Arab Spring was just around this Bahraini movement, the regime needed to justify internationally the crackdown in a sectarian manner. They always pointed to these protesters that they are solely Shia. And then they used the fear of Iran and said Iran wants to interfere and so on. And so I guess that's another important point to take into consideration. They never focus on the social background of these protesters. I mean, it lies in their nature that a large part of these protesters are Shia. But this is due to their social background. So that was never taken into consideration, and if you look at Western media, they don't point to this.
Sorry to interrupt again, but I can't, and yet, the Pearl Roundabout statue was created to commemorate the ties with Saudi Arabia. So, in wiping away bad memories, I mean, there's some irony in taking down a statue.
Thanks for the question. I think the Kuwaiti case is quite different. I mean, certainly I believe the West would want to hold on to Kuwait as an ally. And I think it would be quite successful in doing so, even if the parliament were to become a lot more powerful than it is now. Say if the government were to become responsible to the parliament instead of directly to the Emir. I don't really think that the alliance with the West would suffer any at all. Largely because there's a consensus between the opposition and the supporters of the royal family in kind of the multitude of dangers that Kuwait supposedly faces in its neighborhood. And those stem essentially from all three of its neighbors. From Saudi Arabia, which tried to conquer, well, in its formative stages, tried to conquer Kuwait in the 1920s. Before it consolidated itself. Iraq, obviously, and then Iran because of its political system and its Shiite majority. So that's one difference with Bahrain. The other difference is, of course, the sectarian makeup of the Kuwaiti population. The Sunnis have a clear majority in Kuwait, and so kind of accusing the opposition of working for Iran or something like that would be much harder in the case of Kuwait. The West has already acted as an advocate for the Kuwaiti parliament after the Gulf War, and I think it could definitely find a way to live with a more powerful parliament. So I think the only scenario in which there would be sort of active American support for a crackdown by the royal family on sort of mass protests, if such were to break out, the only case would be if the protesters could be depicted as being somehow radicals, which I think, given past developments, would be hard to do.
My name is Bodo Straub. I have a question to Mr. Rashed. Thank you very much, first of all, for this rapid introduction into the Kuwaiti power struggle. My question is about the nature of this power struggle, because at a certain point you mentioned that there were opposition newspapers shut down, that on the other hand side there were MPs who took off the microphones of government cameras. So apparently this whole debate seems to have been in the public space. So as to me, maybe you can illustrate this more, because you were quoting a lot of people, and apparently there happened to be a public discussion about this whole thing. So it wasn't behind shut doors, but it wasn't public.
Yes, that's right. I mean, the whole debate was public to the extent that it was, it took place in these diwaniyas, which, I mean, originally the word is meant for the room in which the man of the house receives his guests, right? But then when it's the diwaniya for politician, then, as I mentioned, it can swell to 1,200, 1,500 people. So you erect huge tents outside your house, and you can bring people in that way. And of course, among those people, there'll be reporters, and then those reporters will publish almost verbatim accounts of what they saw and heard. And those are the types of accounts, mostly from the newspaper, the Arab Times, that I use, for my source. So those would be published and be accessible to everyone. And so even while the Arab Times itself, in its own editorial policy, was supporting the government, it was still publishing everything that the opposition was saying against the government, all the arguments it was making against the government. So in that sense too, a relatively free press also marks Kuwait as quite different from some of the other kind of more repressive states. That's one. Secondly, much of the debate, of course, took place within Parliament itself, and there too, there's constant coverage of what gets said in Parliament. The only exception was that when the actual grilling of the Prime Minister took place, which he survived and which was followed by the non-cooperation vote, that was held behind closed doors. And that was on the insistence of the government itself, and there was nothing the parliament could do. So whereas they're obliged to submit themselves to questioning, they don't have to do it in front of reporters. And there, the opposition MPs tried to drum up public support for a public grilling, where they were saying, if we're men, we should talk openly before everyone, that kind of thing. Trying to almost emasculate the prime minister, but it didn't work. Nevertheless, it should be pointed out, of course, that the amount of public pressure, was sufficient for the Prime Minister to be forced out by the Emir in November 2011. So, less than a year after this initial crisis that I described in my presentation.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation today. It was good. I wanted to ask first Rashed, and then if I can say, please let me say the three cats. So Rashed, about the media in the West first. In 2011, in January, Bashar al-Assad was interviewed by American journal. I could see, and I told about it, that he was pushed to be afraid of what's going to happen next in Syria, looking at Tunisia, and then Egypt was like almost like warming up for the uprising. Do you think there was a hypocrisy from the West covering the Gulf countries' uprisings and preventing any story bring up events or arousing public masses in the Gulf countries, or did they help to do that? When we look at the publicity amount that covered Syria and Libya, for example. And then, like in Syria, people say immaturely the answer, like why the uprising started, they say after they arrested children, then the uprising or the masses movements uprising came in Syria. Why did Kuwait and Bahrain, for example, after all these abuses of activists and public, why nothing happened there? And then for your presentation, I would like to say about the question mark. I just had an idea that you might have referred to that it's not yet ended in Bahrain and it's coming in spring, maybe. The spring of Bahrain will come back, maybe later. And you will like bring more news for next time. I don't know.
Okay, as for the Western media, there was a little bit of coverage on Kuwait. I do remember seeing even on the BBC News website, for example, when the parliament was stormed in November 2011 by protesters. That was pretty big. It was certainly a first in Kuwaiti history. Afterwards, things died down, and now it's coming back again with the Emir sort of dissolving the 2009 parliament. So the Kuwaiti events, like the arrest of the beating up and arrest of Al-Basmi, or the other person was actually killed, who was not a protester, by the way. He was an alleged alcohol smuggler, but the fact remains that he was beaten to death. These stories did not seem to make it to the Western media, so there you're completely right. And I think in terms of Bahrain too, yes, there was certainly a lot of hypocrisy in the sense that Bahrain was covered to some extent, at least, through the prism of the necessity, supposed necessity for the US of maintaining its Fifth Fleet over there. So it's always, it was always a question of, well, we have to balance this, the Bahraini people's legitimate demands and our need for a good anchorage in the Gulf, this kind of thing. But it's still important to point out that at least the New York Times, when the events in Bahrain were at their height, had some pretty good and impartial coverage, and I think it was Christoph who went over there and talked about ambulance drivers being threatened with execution by Saudi soldiers if they help people. Talked about a Shiite doctor being tortured for helping injured people. Those kinds of things, which if anyone read them, I'm sure people did, could not fail to arouse sympathy for the protesters. So yeah, some things, despite the U.S. interest in maintaining the status quo, did get out. Oh, and briefly on your second question, which I actually forgot about, was why nothing happened in Kuwait. I don't fully agree that nothing happened, because first of all, the Prime Minister got questioned, which before this Prime Minister, no Prime Minister in Kuwaiti history was ever questioned by Parliament. This Prime Minister was questioned 3 times. Secondly, the Prime Minister was forced to resign due to pressure from the opposition. So the Amir actually took the side of the opposition, even though they had a minority in Parliament, a small minority, but it wasn't a big difference with the majority, but still. And lastly, it has thrown the system, which was pretty well oiled for most intents and purposes, into a bit of turmoil. So that now it's not really clear where it's going to go in the next few months. So I think the opposition has had an impact. And Musallam al-Barrak, whom I mentioned several times, he, for example, was put on trial for being one of those who broke into the parliament in 2011. But they can't do anything to him because he enjoys parliamentary immunity. So you know, he's able to get away with it scot-free and actually use it as a badge of honor. And the fact that this can go on in Kuwait already, I think, speaks volumes.
I don't know if we understood your question right, or it was more an advice for our question mark, no? Or could you...
Do you expect more things to happen in Bahrain? Like, sorry for speaking not clear. The question mark, I have just like, I don't know, I've seen it, I received it as you expect real spring to come to Bahrain. Or maybe something like this.
Basically, every day there are demonstrations taking place in Bahrain. They're not taking place in Manama. That is due to the huge police presence there. For example, at the Pearl Roundabout, there's riot police everywhere, or anti-riot police everywhere. So these demonstrations take place in the mainly Shia suburbs, in the east and in the west. So it's not only one part of the country. And if you talk to Bahraini activists or families in general, they are so much involved right now, because in every family there's at least one person injured or in jail. Because, I mean, there's no coverage on this, but there are still so many activists in jail in Bahrain, and as he mentioned, what happened to the doctors that were part of this, as you mentioned, social infrastructure of the Pearl Roundabout. So actually there is something still ongoing in Bahrain, but maybe we can call it spring because the government does not let it happen as it was in Egypt. So maybe spring isn't the right word for it.
Yeah, and also referring to the social space, I think what we wanted to point out is not like the time, and we didn't want to predict anything with the question mark or question if there's like a new spring to come. But what we wanted to point out is more like the spatial dimension of it, which can happen, you know, like parallel to like a crackdown, there can emerge a new space which is not connected to a place, so it can exist like in discourse, like as we showed on Facebook. So this is actually happening, not visible maybe, but it's still something that can like maybe lead to a new like emerge of new activists, new Arab Spring, so-called Arab Spring.
Thank you very much. Are there any more questions? Okay, well let me take this opportunity to thank the both paper presenter, or both the presenters of both papers. Thank you. Let me just take this opportunity to thank the presenters of both papers for very stimulating, thought-provoking, excellent papers. I learned a great deal. Thank you very, very much.